We now stand in a silent toast to all absent and departed members and brother adventurers, wherever they may be. Please be seated. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world-famous Adventures Club of Los Angeles. My name is Alex Schumate, number 1210. I'm the president for this year. So, as is tradition here, we're going to begin our meeting with an introduction of guests. Introduction of guests by members, and if you're a guest who kind of found their way here on their own, please introduce yourself and share a little bit about your story. Because we're running a little bit behind tonight, we're also going to lump in leaving and returning on an adventure. So please, if you are returning from a fantastic adventure or leaving on a fantastic adventure, give us a quick 30-second synopsis on what you have or what you're going to be doing. And if it's worth more than 30 seconds, which I hope it is, I hope you'll get with myself or Ken Hudson, our first VP, to plan to come and give a talk about it at the Adventurers Club. So, any guests? Testing. Sounds like this one's good. Front row, David, on the left.
My name is Hal McNaughton. This is my second visit, and I thought about this after I left last week. My last really adventure I'm proud of, I was way up in the mountains in the Philippines to a town that didn't have running water or electricity, and I was able to donate some money, help get a preschool started there. The organization I belong with has over 200,000 students that went through their preschool. They're very, very poor.
Fantastic. That sounds like a talk. We got a whole row of guests right here.
Hi, my name's Ken. This is, I think, my fourth meeting here. I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, but I've lived all over the world, and I'm very glad to have found a club that welcomes me as a guest. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Scott, and I'm an alcoholic. My latest adventure was doing some long-distance motorcycling through the backcountry of California on the way from the Mexican border to Bishop. 8 days completely off-road. It's called the Backcountry Discovery Route. It was pretty fantastic. I took photos. Maybe it'll be a thing.
I don't mean to expose you, but your last name is McQueen, correct?
My last name is McQueen, yes.
Yeah. Distant relate. He came up the stairs with the last name McQueen and a motorcycle helmet in his hand, and I put two and two together, so.
Are you thinking Steve or Lightning? Both? Hi, everybody. My name is Grant. This is my third time here, I want to say, but the first two were years ago. My last adventure was doing some spelunking in Puerto Rico, and my next adventure is going to be recreating my grandfather's canoe trip down the Yukon and Alaska. So, doing some stuff there. Look forward to getting to know y'all. Thank you.
Fantastic.
As a resource, the woman on our audiovisual room tonight did sled dogging in the Yukon. So she's got connections up north.
My name is Edward. I've been on a lot of adventures, some of which I'm proud of. And others, the statute of limitations has not passed yet.
Hi, my name's Steve Whiteman. I'm not a member, but I've been on many adventures and around the world, all kinds of stuff. But my recent one was with my two kids. We just got back from Arizona, northern Arizona, and we did the meteor crater, and we went to Two Guns and visited the Apache murder cave and the hideout of Jesse James back in the winter of 18-something. I can't remember the exact date, but it was always an adventure all the time, so just having fun in life.
Chase, care to say anything?
We're sitting in a hall named after this gentleman, just to make him embarrassed.
Keith Chase, former president of the club, in attendance. Joined the club, and I believe you said, Keith, it was 1961? 61, 62, somewhere like that. So Keith is probably one of the sole gentlemen here who knew some of the original founders of the club. And I believe you said his father was a second-generation founder, so right in after the Jack Rulac and his crew. So a lot of history. A lot of history.
So Chuck Junkie 1026, so our presenter tonight is Michael Oddenino. So I met him years ago in Peru. We spent a couple years down there.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here, and I'll look forward to sharing some stories with you.
For you history fans, Michael also helps run the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable, which is just a crackerjack, almost PhD historian grade program. Once a month, I highly recommend them.
Hi, my name is Jeannie. I've been here over 100 times. I'm the mascot. Ask Steve if you have any questions.
I think you may now have some competition. Phoebe's well into the double digits.
Brian Creasy, 1186, and this is my guest, Colonel Cole Calloway. He's kind of technically my boss, so be really nice to him, please, because I want to get that deployment to Fiji instead of Afghanistan.
Hi, my name's Cole Calloway. Thanks, Brian. And it's Tahiti. That's where we're trying to go. He's been trying to get me in here for the past few years. The last time I was actually en route, and someone hit me in the car. So I was literally on my way in. But so I made it in this time, no problem. But my last adventure, I just came back 2 weeks ago from Jordan in the Middle East and spent 10 months there for the military. So it was a great adventure and did a lot of cool things there. So thank you.
Members?
Jeff Holmes, 1148. I'm here with Yoko from Tokyo. We just got back from a short trip to Iowa, and this doesn't sound like an adventure, and maybe we're all tired of this, but I visited a gardening shop in a small town called Spencer, Iowa. And again, maybe we're all tired hearing about COVID, but sometimes you hear things, you go, what? And he said that he got COVID twice, badly. And many people in the town got it twice, badly. And I didn't know that happened that much. And he also said that after he had all these horrible conditions, he then got vaccinated. And he said they're finding that in 30 to 40% of the people who get vaccinated after they've had really bad conditions, that it reduces or eliminates their conditions. I've not heard that anyplace. So I hope you're all getting vaccinated, right? So.
Oh, see, no, Kevin is not a guest. Kevin is a new member, which is a nice segue. I'll see Bob Aronoff is here, which is another club legend. That's great to see, as always.
It's always an extreme pleasure to come to the club.
Welcome back, Bob.
And Bob, your number's in the 800s also, right? 837. Yeah. Do you want to tell us anything, Mr. 969, Dave?
Dave Umad in 969. I've had some health issues over the past year, but I've also moved to San Diego, too. So that's why you don't see me at the club very often. And although I do try to get on as much as I can for the cocktail hour, and I've had a good talk with Robert Willis-Croft and Jim Dorsey and Dr. Bernie Harris by Zoom. Thank you.
Real quick, well, it's great to meet you, Dave. I hope we'll get to catch up after the meeting.
The club left its former quarters in 1989 and was wandering around for 5 years until this great spot was found. And that's the guy that found it.
Yeah, absolutely. We all owe a debt to Keith Chase, whose name adorns this very hall.
One returning? Or?
Do you have a returning?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So a tiny returning from adventure if driving to Pomona to watch a drag race is an adventure. When I started going to drag races, they used to have 3,000 horsepower and do the quarter in under 5 seconds. Now at Pomona, they're running 11,000 horsepower. They don't even run the quarter mile anymore, because if they did, the cars would be topping out at approximately 400 miles an hour, and it's the shutdown space. Most of the tracks were built in the 50s, and they're running 1,000 yards because they're still hitting 330 miles an hour and barely able to stop in time. One of the alcohol fuel dragsters went into the gravel overrun, which is like the truck runoff on a mountain pass. So the fun thing is if you go to an NHRA event today, you get a pit pass with your ticket. And it seems if you wear the T-shirt of the team up to where they are working on the car between rounds because they completely overhaul the engine between rounds. They change pistons and connecting rods in an hour while getting ready for the next run, because one run and they're done. And if you're wearing the team's t-shirt, they'll give you a piston or a connecting rod. I happen to have a clutch disc from the winner, who is a woman, and her name is blanking on me. She's big, famous. Any case, she goes 330 miles an hour. And the clutch disc, multiple discs, that's a slipper clutch, because the wheel can't spin, and the engine's doing 10,000 RPM. So the clutch is like a centrifugal clutch on a motorcycle. It doesn't all come in at once, and it's not fully engaged till they're halfway down the track. But just to hear and I'm done after this sentence. You don't even have to pay the $60 to go to the event. At Pomona, they have a giant Diamond Vision screen visible from Fairplex Drive, and hundreds of people set up lawn chairs across the street and watch the Diamond Vision, and when a Top Fuel dragster or funny car runs, you don't just hear it, you feel it everywhere you are, anywhere on the fairgrounds. So if you like cars, go back. It's pretty exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, David. I know you always got the inside scoop on all the best air shows and car races in LA. And before we move on to further business, I want to call special attention to a guest of the club, Phoebe Piper, who's in our AV room. She's generously volunteered to help us out tonight. And Phoebe is one of our beloved guests at this club. So thank you, Phoebe. Your efforts are not unappreciated here. So thank you. And I would also like to then move into our next business, which is a very exciting occasion for me, which is inducting a new member. So as some of you who have been here in the past few months have known, we've been inducting the 2020 cohort, kind of sporadically throughout the years. They've been able to come back to the club. We had a handful of members that joined while we were closed down, and while they've been members in full, active, good standing, have not gotten to appreciate the full joys of being formally initiated at the podium. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our new member, Kevin Martin. As one of his sponsors, I can speak a little bit to his adventures. I know that he's had a variety of adventures. He grew up for a time in China, I believe, and he also has had a ton of adventures in the Middle East, working with the Defense Department. Famously, or infamously, he's known for starting the first diabetes clinic in Kabul, for which he received a variety of death threats from the Taliban, if I'm not mistaken, specifically for employing women, and also for starting the first private expat bar in Kabul. And I don't know which was less popular with the Taliban. You'll have to tell us. And when he did his new member interview, he was telling us about, aside from those stories about ibex hunting in Kyrgyzstan, which sounds fantastic. Horseback hunting for days on end through the mountains. And I think he's an adventurer after all of our hearts in the most classic sense. So without further ado, please welcome our one of our newest members, Kevin Martin. Thank you.
So, Alec, thank you so much for that introduction. It is an absolute pleasure to be in front of you talking about me, which I really don't like talking about, but I have longed to be part of something like this for a long time. I've as Alec has mentioned, I did my first international trip to China, where I was basically an exchange student at the age of 17, in a small village called Baoding, which had no silverware, and I did not know how to use chopsticks at the time. So I had to get used to that. But that really brought on the adventure spirit within me. I remember my grandfather, my grandfather and grandmother were great adventurers, traveling to the Middle East, back in the 50s, Haiti in the 80s, Russia, before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Having my grandfather tell me stories of David Livingstone and the great African continent, and really drove a spirit of adventure within me. And I've always wanted to travel. My parents gave up a great trip to go to the Middle East because I ended up at 3 years old having pneumonia. So they had their tickets, everything was planned. They chose, we're just going to have to opt out on this. I razz them about that every day. You should have went. I would have been fine. It seemed to have stopped their series of adventures, which is something I think that drives us all. I spent, as Alex said, I spent 5 years in Afghanistan. Prior to that, I was 3 years in Kyrgyzstan at Manas Air Base with the Defense Energy Support Center. I was transferred into Afghanistan to run their fuel logistics for jet fuel, 90% of which came into Pakistan and the northern areas of Hairat, which would basically come in through Uzbekistan. After that, I had turned into a contractor. There was definitely more money, but without being associated directly with the military, I had to rely on my own resources, and that included security. So several, as Alex pointed out, death threats, bombs that have blown up in front of me. Spent a lot of time in Pakistan, which I don't really care to do. That was the Northwest Frontier Province was a horrible place. However, I did get to explore an ancient Buddhist monastery in the Northwest Frontier Province that is basically untouched. It's from the 3rd century BC, and it is untouched because of the war that has been going on and the Taliban control and such. From 5 years in Afghanistan, I was in 2010. I was sent into Haiti after the earthquake to work with the United Nations as a contractor, and I spent 3 years in Haiti as well. So these countries hold a special place in my heart. It's hard to see the assassination of a president in Haiti. To what's going on currently in Afghanistan with the Taliban regaining control and what they're doing in these towns. So I speak to you with kind of a bittersweet, I love being part of this club, but yet I see that what made me part of this club is the adventures I had in these countries that are still struggling. And I wish I could do more. I really do. So I want to thank you, Alec, again. I want to thank you, club members, for inducting me into this as a member. It means a whole lot to me, and adventures never die. So with that, Alec, thank you.
All right, well stated, Kevin, well stated. And with that, we have your formal effects of membership. First off, your membership certificate. This certifies that Kevin D. Martin, who left the beaten path and made for adventure, has been admitted to companionship in the Adventurers Club as an active member at Los Angeles, California, as of October 1st, 2020, member number 1226. So Kevin, welcome to the Brotherhood. Congratulations. So we'll go over to the flag in a second. We also have your member card for all of our reciprocal clubs all over the world, and your member button, which we have a fantastic tradition of decorating however you see fit. And that button, whenever your time comes, will be retired when we all of us members go on the great adventure. Those buttons are kept in great honor here. So Kevin, welcome to the Brotherhood. We'll grab a quick photo in front of the map. And without further ado, gentlemen, member number 1226, Kevin Martin. Thank you. All right, gentlemen, without further ado, because we're running a little bit behind tonight, I will introduce our first Vice President, Ken Hudson, who will be interviewing our speaker for the evening, Mike Oddenino, who has a fantastic story about an unknown Civil War battle that I'm sure we'll all take great interest in. So thank you, Ken, and thank you, Mike.
We have a great program for you tonight. Looking forward to hearing a lot about this. I'd like to introduce Michael Oddenino. He's, I'll say a Civil War buff, which greatly understates that. So, but I'd like to have you tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would. Sure. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and I have been out in California for quite a few years practicing law out here. And I've always maintained my interest in history, as the D.C. area, particularly Virginia, is full of rich history of the United States. And I've also traveled in Peru and other places in South America, and I'm a history buff of the Incas and Aztecs. And then being in Pasadena, been able to work with the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable.
So you're very active in that organization?
Yes.
And are they, what does that organization do?
We sponsor a monthly presentation, and it's usually someone who's either written a book on a particular Civil War topic or someone who is a professor of Civil War history, and they have been able to give us some fascinating insights into aspects of the Civil War. The Civil War, of course, is that war that continues to be with us today in so many ways, as it involves slavery and the residue of slavery that we still are battling today.
Okay. Sorry, fiddling with the microphone. We're disorganized tonight, as is often the case. So thanks for hanging with us. So you're here tonight to tell us about a small battle that had great ripple effect.
I am, and I should tell you that the reason I'm here tonight is because of your member Chuck Jonke. And I was on a adventure in Peru when I met Mr. Jonke, and we, there weren't that many Americans down there at the time, and so we were talking, and he was telling me how when he got back to the States, he was going to go to dental school and become a dentist, and he promised me free dental care for life. So I thought, well, that was pretty cool. And then I went back to the East Coast. He came back to California, and I had not heard from him for 9 years, and he hadn't heard from me either. And then
it was off at dental school, no doubt.
It must have been that time in dental school is what I was figuring. He was getting ready for me. And so when I moved to California, a friend said, "Oh, we have to take you to Tijuana." So I said, "Okay." So we went on an adventure to Tijuana, and walking down Avenida Revolucion, the main drag of Tijuana, and who do I run into but Chuck Jonke. Haven't seen or heard from him 9 years. So he then informed me that he pursued music instead of dental school, so there went my free dental care, And then a couple years later, I was at a bookstore in Pasadena, a great old bookstore, it's not there anymore, Alexandria too, and what do I find but a CD by Chuck Jonke.
Ah.
So we then became more in contact with each other. And I said, "Hey, Chuck, I'm taking my older daughter back to Peru." And he said, "Oh, great." So I'm in Peru, and I get a call from Chuck Jonke in the States. He said, "While you're there, could you get me the jawbone of an ass?" I'm like, "The jawbone of an ass?" And he said, "Yeah, the Spanish name is a quijada." He said they use it as a musical instrument. They loosen the teeth, and then they shake it, and it makes a very unique sound. And he said it's particularly popular on the coast. I said, "Well, I'm up in near Cusco. I'm not anywhere near the coast." And he said, "Well, see what you can find." So I go to some music stores in Cusco, and lo and behold,
I find the jawbone of an ass. And I said, how much for that? And the guy said, $20. I said, I'll take it.
Done.
And so I go through customs carrying the jawbone of an ass, thanks to Chuck. So,
Well, he's gotten a lot of mileage out of that, I know.
Yeah, he has. So, anyway, so it's been great knowing Chuck, and I'm a big fan of the Adventures Club because all of your adventures are just so amazing, and I stand in awe of what you and your members do.
Well, we appreciate you being here tonight. I hope you spend more time here.
Thank you.
So,
Well, yeah.
Tell us about Ball's Bluff.
Okay, well, Ball's Bluff was fought early in the war in 1861, and it's a battle that very few people have heard of. It's just not a well-known battle. It was very small by later standards, although at the time it seemed very significant, and you'll find out why. But what I have found fascinating about this little battle is the connections this battle has to people and places and things today. And you will find as I go through that you might say, well, there's no way that could be connected to this 1861 battle, but I will surprise you and show there is a connection.
I noticed that the data on the PowerPoint was from 2 days ago, so you're keeping it current.
I keep it current, yes. So.
All right, so what was the Battle of Ball's Bluff?
Okay, the Battle of Ball's Bluff was a battle fought on October 21 of 1861, okay? And let me tell you first what connections I'm going to make with this battle, and then I'll tell you a little more about how the battle relates to the general history of the Civil War, okay?
Okay.
So with respect to this, you're going to find connections to Abraham Lincoln. You're going to find connections to William Tecumseh Sherman, to Stonewall Jackson, to General Winfield Scott, who was the overall commander of the Union forces at the beginning of the Civil War, to General George McClellan, to the CIA, to the Barnum and Bailey Circus, yes, and to the Maynard Carbine, a Massachusetts rifle company, okay, and then to George Washington. You think, I got the wrong war. No, your connection with George Washington. And then the New York City Marathon. And then the Marquis de Lafayette. Again, you think the wrong war, but nope, you'll find the connection. Alexander Hamilton. The United States Senate has a connection with the Battle of Ball's Bluff, as does the famous song, The Vacant Chair. The Vacant Chair, we'll get into that story, but this song became perhaps the most popular song North and South during the Civil War. You'll also find a connection between Great Britain and between the battle and Panama. And in addition to Panama, you're going to find a connection with the country of Mexico and this battle. Harvard University, you'll find a connection with, as well as the state of California. Even though the battle was fought in Virginia, you're going to find a California connection. You're going to find an Oregon connection. You're going to find a connection between this battle and the Transcontinental Railroad. You're going to find this battle a connection to the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith. You're going to find a connection between this battle and the Bahamas, and between Harry S. Truman, President Truman, as well as Loretta Velasquez. Okay? You're going to also find a connection between this battle and Preston Brooks, the caning of Charles Sumner in the Senate in 1856. You also are going to find a connection between John Brown. Many of you know of John Brown and his attempt to have a slave uprising. Also, the Pudding Stone Monument in Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg. You also have a connection between George Marshall, okay, of World War II fame. You're going to have another connection between the Tammany Monument at Gettysburg, and then Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and then the United States Congress Committee on the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, excuse me, as well as the Golden Gate Bridge and Paul Revere. You're going to have Alcatraz. You're going to have John Steinbeck. You're going to have Moby Dick, the Arlington National Cemetery, the U.S. Supreme Court, Quincy, Massachusetts, black granite, bears, President Rutherford B. Hayes, the Comanche Indians, Gustav Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower, Texas, Theodore Roosevelt, the University of Georgia, Joseph Pulitzer of Pulitzer Prize fame, Egypt, Martin Luther King Jr., Winston Churchill, the Statue of Liberty, and the coronavirus. Okay?
Okay, I have to see that.
Yeah, so you'll say, okay, how are we going to get to all of those? Well, let's look at the Battle of Ball's Bluff. You can go to the next slide. There you go.
You left out the kitchen sink, by the way.
Right. We'll get there. The Battle of Ball's Bluff was fought in October 21 of 1861. Relatively small battle. And it was fought 3 months to the day from the Battle of First Manassas, also known as the Battle of First Bull Run, okay? The reason it has two names is the North and the South used different naming techniques. The North named battles after the closest river or stream, and the South named battles after the closest city or town. Hence, the very first major engagement, First Manassas or First Bull Run, has two different names, but it's the same battle. It was a surprise to both sides. Both the North and the South felt that they were going to easily win this war. And it came as even more of a shock to the North when they lost, because you had civilians had come from Washington, D.C. It's about 45 miles, Manassas is, from Washington, D.C. And they were overrun by the Union soldiers retreating at the end of the battle. It was a major shock to the Northern and the
Not as
to
planned.
the Congress. Not as planned. And then what happened is after that battle, you had the congressmen say, oh, well, let's pass these resolutions to make sure that people know that there's no a desire to get rid of slavery. You can go to the next slide. These resolutions, we just want to preserve the Union, that's all. Maybe we can end this fight now, but that didn't help. Next, you find after the battle that George McClellan, famous Union general, was appointed by Lincoln to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac, replacing McDowell, okay? Well, then in August, right after Ball's Bluff, you had another Union disaster in Missouri, the loss at Wilson's Creek. So you had two major battles, both losses by the Union, and the Union was stunned. They just can't believe that they were losing these major battles. The next instance was in September at a place called Munson Hill. Munson Hill is about, if you can go to the next slide, the Bailey's Crossroads, which is where the Union Army was located, about a mile from Bailey's Crossroads, which is Bailey's Crossroads 5 or 6 miles from Washington, D.C. So the Union Army's there, but they were afraid because Jeb Stewart had his army, and Bailey's Crossroads, by the way, if you go to the next slide, was named after Bailey, one of the Bailey members, family members who did Barnum and Bailey Circus, so there you have a connection between Barnum and Bailey and this battle. Next, you had Jeb Stewart on Munson Hill with an undetermined force as far as the Union knew. But they did have reports that there were a large amount of cannon on Munson Hill. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see Jeb Stewart's hat. And right there at the end of the hat is a feather. And Jeb Stewart was known for wearing flashy clothing and having nice feathers in his hat. And well, Mrs. Munson's hat, he overtook the Timothy Munson's home on Munson Hill. And Timothy was a Union sympathizer, had vacated the home when the Confederates came. And Mrs. Munson had a large hat collection. And the story of Jeb Stewart's feathers in his hat came from him commandeering a number of the feathers from Mrs. Munson's hats at Munson Hill.
So you had a wartime supply.
Right. And then, go ahead, McClellan was assessing what to do. And remember, McClellan was known as the very timid general. Ever since he was appointed right after Manassas, Lincoln was trying to get McClellan to do something with his army, but McClellan did nothing other than train his army. So he did nothing with Stewart's men at Munson Hill. Well, Stewart then left Munson Hill. And when he left Munson Hill, the Union forces, of course, occupied. And he left Munson Hill with no engagement at all. Stewart just left. They got up there and they find out, if you go to the next slide, that all the cannon were nothing but logs painted black, or Quaker guns, as they called it, okay? And so you had all these Quaker guns on Munson Hill, and the Washington, D.C. newspapers went nuts. Entire Union Army held at bay by Quaker guns, okay? So you had Manassas, or Bull Run, in July. You had Wilson's Creek in August. And then you had this embarrassment right on the steps of Washington, D.C. in September. And so the North is just reeling from, one defeat or embarrassment after another. And then if you see where we're at here, and you can see Washington, D.C., and then northwest the Potomac River is Ball's Bluff. It's on the Virginia side across the Potomac, with Maryland on the other side. If you look at Washington, D.C., it was originally a 10 square mile area. You can go to the next slide, yeah. That 10 square mile area, however, the part of the original Washington, D.C. area on the Virginia side of the Potomac was retroceded to Virginia in the 1840s. And so now Washington, D.C. is not a 10 square mile. It is what you see on this image in front of you. And the Virginia portion of that used to be Washington, D.C., of course, some of the most valuable real estate in the state of Virginia at this point in time. Okay, so you had Union soldiers on the Virginia side of the Potomac, but farther up, closer to what is now Leesburg, Virginia, you had the Confederates in control. And McClellan had been criticized for his lack of action. And in fact, there was a song that became popular at that time called All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet Along the Potomac, excuse me. Getting my wars mixed up here. All Quiet Along the Potomac Tonight. And it was mocking McClellan doing nothing, that he had all these soldiers and nothing was happening. Well, Ball's Bluff is along the Potomac, northwest of D.C., and it was so quiet that the pickets were fraternizing with each other. So the Confederate and the Union pickets would meet in the Potomac and they exchange tobacco or newspapers or whatever. And they had an agreement. We won't shoot you, you don't shoot us, because it won't do anybody any good anyway, because nothing's happening. So that was the situation at Ball's Bluff in October of 1861. Put in charge of the Union forces at Ball's Bluff was Charles Pomeroy Stone. This is a picture of Stone and his daughter, Hetty. Now, who was Charles Stone? Well, he had originally served in California, and he had served with William Tecumseh Sherman, and they were close friends. Stone was known as a fantastic officer. He also worked with General Winfield Scott. Now, General Winfield Scott was in charge of the entire Union Army at that time. He was described as the manliest of men. And you see this image in 1847. He was the hero of the Mexican War. In fact, many Americans, North and South, were named after General Winfield Scott because of his heroics in Mexico. Well, General Winfield Scott worked with none other than Charles Stone in setting up the defenses of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. at the time of the Civil War became the most heavily fortified city in the world. And it was in large part because of Winfield Scott and Charles Stone's efforts in making it the most fortified.
So this was after the initial battles, or before?
Well, this is early on it started, okay? Yeah. So, and it continued to become more and more fortified, and Charles Stone was one of the individuals who was responsible for it. Now, if you then consider in March of 1861, you had Lincoln's inauguration. Well, it was Charles Stone who was in charge of security. They didn't have the Secret Service at that time, but Charles Stone took on the role of the the equivalent of the Secret Service, and secured the primary safety of the president during the inauguration. And in the carriage with Abraham Lincoln, sitting next to Abraham Lincoln, was his friend who had been a lawyer practicing in Springfield, Illinois with him, named Edward Dickinson Baker, okay? Now, Edward Dickinson Baker you'll see the important role that he plays. Now, in charge of the Confederate Army at Ball's Bluff was Nathan Shanks Evans. Now, Shanks was his nickname because he had skinny legs, and at West Point, the other cadets made fun of him and gave him the nickname Shanks. However, he was a fierce fighter. In fact, before the Civil War, he had fought in Texas. And he'd fought in Texas, and he had fought the Comanche Indians. And if you know anything about the Comanche Indians, they were the fiercest warriors of all the tribes. There's a great book called Empire of the Summer Moon, if anyone's interested in learning about the Comanches. It's just phenomenal. But you know that he was cutting his teeth fighting the Comanches, so when the Civil War started, Nathan Shanks Evans was an experienced fighter. And he fought at First Manassas, or First Bull Run, with Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson got his nickname Stonewall at the Battle of First Manassas. And Shanks Evans was one who was fortifying a good bit of the line that Stonewall Jackson was in command over and held off the various Union assaults, and hence standing like a stone wall. So Shanks Evans was a very experienced fighter, okay? He was under P.G.T. Beauregard, but it was Shanks Evans who was actually on the ground at Ball's Bluff in 1861. On the Union side, you had the oldest West Point graduate who served in active duty, and that was General George McCall. And his Union forces were at Langley. Now, you may know that Langley is now the home of the CIA, okay? And McClellan sent McCall and his forces to Drainesville, which is closer to Ball's Bluff than Langley is, much closer. And Stone knew this, okay? So then if you go look at the area around Ball's Bluff, just south of Ball's Bluff, you have Edwards Ferry, and the Union had forces there as well, okay? So Stone was aware that he had forces, McCall at Drainesville and Gorman at Edwards Ferry. And the name of the area, Ball's Bluff, came from the Ball family, because another Confederate who was there in October of 1861 was George Washington Ball. You may recall that George Washington's mother was Mary Ball Washington. So the area of Ball's Bluff was named after the family of Mary Ball Washington, and one of the relatives, George Washington Ball, was actually at Ball's Bluff in October of 1861. Now, if you see here on this next image, you'll see the Maryland side, and then you have in the middle of the Potomac, Harrison's Island, and then Ball's Bluff rising up on the Virginia side. Now, if you look at the next map, you'll see that you had Union forces all along there, and Harrison's Island was sort of the stopping off point. They would move forces to Harrison's Island, and then because of the proximity to Harrison's Island to the bluff, they would then move up to the bluff to get the soldier. Here's an image of the Ball's Bluff from the Harrison's Island. You can see it's a pretty steep. I've been there, and it's not a small bluff. It's significant. Well, on October 20th of 1861, the Union forces, Stone sent Captain Chase Philbrick of New England to reconnoiter what was over on the other side, because they didn't know. Remember, they don't have any type of real intelligence, and they have no surveillance or anything. So they need to send boots on the ground over there. So Chase Philbrick goes at night up the bluff, and at night with his soldiers. And remember, talk about an adventure. A lot of these soldiers are from Harvard. Okay, they're New Englanders. They're young boys. They'd never fought in a war. And so can you imagine that adventure? Here they're going out at dark into enemy territory where they might be shot. First of all, just traveling from New England down to Virginia would have been a fantastic adventure for most of these young men, okay? All right, so they are stealthily going through the bluff. They get to a rise, okay? And over the top of the rise, they see a Confederate camp. And so they sneak back down, and they head back across the Potomac and report. And so they tell Charles Stone about this Confederate camp that they've spotted. So you can go to the next slide. Stone, following McClellan's orders to show a good demonstration, decides that, okay, they describe it as a small camp. We can send enough soldiers over there to wipe them out, and that will make the strong demonstration that McClellan wants us to make. So Stone knew that McCall was in Drainesville and that Gorman was at Edwards Ferry. So he felt he could send soldiers over there and have plenty of backup should anything go awry. Well, what McClellan didn't tell Stone was that he had ordered McCall back to Langley. This is before the CIA was there. He had ordered McCall back to Langley, but didn't tell Stone, okay? So the morning of October 21, Stone sent Charles Devens, Colonel Charles Devens, to take a group of soldiers across the Potomac, up, you can move the next one, to take the rebel camp, okay? So Devens gets his soldiers, and Devens' interesting character, go to the next slide. He became not only a justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, but he also became Attorney General under Rutherford B. Hayes, okay? But at this time, in October 21, he's crossing with soldiers across the Potomac up Ball's Bluff. He takes his men, they go up the bluff in the morning, and you can keep going. And so you can see it's a steep climb up the bluff. They get to the top. This is looking over to the Maryland side, the top of the bluff. And then he leaves 100 men of the 20th Massachusetts, which was known as the Harvard Regiment. So we had the Harvard connection there, right? Now, this is not a photo of Ball's Bluff. This image here is actually from Fredericksburg, but it gives you a sense of, 100 soldiers waiting at the top of the bluff while Charles Devens took his contingent farther into the interior of Virginia. The interesting thing is about the 20th Mass is that the civilians had donated these brand new long coats to all of the soldiers in the 20th Mass. They were beautiful gray coats. So the 20th Mass was decked out in wonderful gray coats. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see this is what Devens is moving. He's moving across the open area, and this is preserved today. It's just like it was in October of 1861. They've done a phenomenal job. So when so Devens and his soldiers get to that point where Philbrick described where the camp was, imagine these young soldiers. They're about ready to get shot at for the first time. Can you imagine that adventure? Okay, and so they get up to the top. They're ready to attack, and what happens? Well, they find, if you look at the next slide, absolutely nothing. There was no rebel camp. Philbrick and his men, nervous and young, they had apparently seen the shadows from the moon and the like, and they mistook shadows for a camp, and so there was no Confederate camp there. So you can see Ball's Bluff was an accident waiting to happen. They looked around, they see nothing, and so Charles Devens has moved his soldiers out farther from the bluff, leaving the 20th Mass still on the bluff. And he goes ahead, and you can move the next one. And so he's moving farther out, okay? And Charles Devens says, next slide, I'm going to do some reconnaissance while I'm here, so see what's here. So he goes over, and who does he trip into? He accidentally runs into the 17th Mississippi. Now, the 17th Mississippi had no uniforms. So you had the 20th Mass in gray and the 17th Mississippi in no uniforms. The 17th Mississippi was, they had been bear hunters before the war. And they had very skilled firing skill set. And they had gotten weapons before the war from the Massachusetts Arms Company. So you had these breech-loading weapons that the 17th Mississippi had, whereas the Massachusetts soldiers were using muskets. So it was an interesting, yeah, a little bit of an advantage, okay? Ahead of the 17th Mississippi was Winfield Scott Featherston. Remember many people named their sons after Winfield Scott. Here you have a Confederate soldier named after who was Winfield Scott, who was at that time head of the entire Union Army, okay? So Winfield Scott and his Mississippians were engaged with Devon's New England soldiers, and they kept fighting back and forth. And they moved more and more. You can keep going with the slide here. Okay, and they kept pushing the Union soldiers back because, and if you go to the battlefield today, you'll find that you're driving through a residential neighborhood, and you'll think, wait a minute, what is this? But it's just on the other side of the residential neighborhood, and the developer did work closely to preserve most of the battlefield. And so a lot of the battlefield where this initial fighting took place, you can still see, and it's there. Go ahead. And they also had, the Confederates had an advantage because, next slide, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jennifer was the head of the Confederate cavalry, and Shanks Evans had his headquarters closer to Edwards Ferry, a little farther south than the actual Ball's Bluff. And Lieutenant Walter Jennifer had been, let's stay with Jennifer for a minute. Walter Jennifer had been at West Point. He did not graduate, but he did make the top half of the class possible, okay? If you know what I mean by that. But Walter Jennifer was a fantastic cavalry person. In fact, he invented the Jennifer saddle. So he was well known as a cavalry expert, okay? And we'll hear more of him later. But what he did was he kept Shanks Evans informed of the progress of the battle and allowed Shanks Evans to keep sending reinforcements to the actual site of the battle, okay? Also present at Ball's Bluff was Elijah White, who was a Leesburg native who was on leave from his normal Confederate regiment, and he stepped in and started fighting with the Confederates at Ball's Bluff. But you'll hear more of Elijah White later. Okay, the battle kept going, and they kept pushing them back, and then you can go ahead and next one. And General Stone met with Edward Dickinson Baker. Remember Edward Dickinson Baker was the one who was in the carriage with Lincoln's inauguration because they had practiced it. Well, who was Edward Dickinson Baker? Well, he was born in Great Britain. You can, next slide. And he had practiced law with, not with, but during the same time as Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. Go ahead. And then there's a story that Lincoln told that when Edward Dickinson Baker found out that because he had been born in England, that the, you go ahead the next one, that he could not become president because he had been born in England, that he cried. Lincoln said Edward Dickinson Baker cried. He was such a patriot, okay, that he loved his adopted country, okay? And before the war, next slide, when Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, had been killed, it was Edward Dickinson Baker who actually almost single-handedly went out and captured the perpetrators of the crime. And they said he did that at great risk to himself. So there's substantial evidence that Edward Dickinson Baker was a very brave individual, okay, as well as a patriot. Next slide. Lincoln named his first child after Edward Dickinson Baker. He named him Eddie Baker Lincoln. Now, some of you may know that Lincoln was the only president to have a, go ahead, next slide, a patent issued to him. So Lincoln had a patent. He also, next slide, was a poet. And he wrote a poem because Eddie Baker Lincoln, his son, died. So I'm going to share that poem with you because I think it gives you an idea not only of the kind of the feelings of Lincoln had, but remember, Lincoln had this connection with Edward Dickinson Baker that most people don't know about, and his own son was named after Eddie Baker Lincoln, after Edward Dickinson Baker. So the poem is as follows. Those midnight stars are sadly dim that late so brilliantly shone, and the crimson tinge from cheek and lip with the heart's warm life has flown. The angel of death was hovering nigh, and the lovely boy was called to die. The silken waves of his glossy hair lie still over his marble brow, and the pearly lip and pearly cheek, the presence of death, avow. Pure little bud in kindness given, in mercy taken to bloom in heaven. Happier far is the angel child with the harp and the crown of gold, who warbles now at the Savior's feet, the glory to us untold. Eddie meet blossom of heavenly love, dwells in the spirit world above. Farewell, sweet Eddie, farewell, we bid thee adieu. Affection's wail cannot reach thee now, deep though it be and true. Bright is the home to him now given, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. So that's a poem that Lincoln wrote, and
Nicely done.
Thank you. I want you to know that, you know, that Lincoln had this affection for his son that was also named after Edward Dickinson Baker. Most people don't know that Baker was the one in the carriage with him during his inauguration, and that his first son was named after him. Okay, next one, Edward Dickinson Baker had acquitted himself very well in the Mexican War. He was a hero of the Mexican War. He had also worked closely in Panama. And then after he left Panama, he moved to San Francisco, and he started practicing law in San Francisco, and he developed an affection for California. And his law partner was Isaac Wistar, and you'll hear this name again too in this story. Isaac Wistar became his partner. And then they were both friends with the California Supreme Court Justice, David Terry, and the U.S. Senator from California, David Broderick, one of the U.S. senators. Well, David Broderick and Terry, the Chief Justice, had a duel. Can you imagine? This is a true story. The California Chief Justice and the U.S. sitting senator had a duel. And
we need more of that.
Yeah, well, Terry was pro-slavery, Broderick was anti-slavery, and Terry killed Broderick in this duel. Broderick is buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery in San Francisco, and there's a monument to Broderick at that cemetery today. But the eulogy was given by Edward Dickinson Baker. So Edward Dickinson Baker was not only a great soldier and a patriot and brave, but he was eloquent as well. And this is it. He says, "But the last word must be spoken, and the imperious mandate of death must be fulfilled. Thus, O brave heart, we bear thee to thy rest. Thus, surrounded by tens of thousands, we leave thee to the equal grave. As in life, no other voice among us so rung its trumpet blast upon the ear of free men, so in death its echoes will reverberate amid our mountains and valleys until truth and valor cease to appeal to the human heart. Good friend, true hero, hail and farewell." So that gives you an idea of kind of the skill set of Edward Dickinson Baker. And the other sitting senator was John Conness. And John Conness got Edward Dickinson Baker's David Broderick's walking stick, okay, and presented it as a gift to Abraham Lincoln, okay. And that walking stick, or the cane of David Broderick, who the U.S. senator from California who was killed in the duel, was actually at the Reagan Library when they had the Lincoln exhibit a few years ago. So it is still out there. And now, while Edward Dickinson Baker continued practicing law in San Francisco, he then was approached by those in Oregon to say, "Hey, we think we can get you elected senator if you would come up to Oregon. You know, the Republican Party is fresh and young here. We can do it." And he did. And so he became a member of the Senate from Oregon. And no sooner did he get into the Senate than Judah Benjamin, the representative from Louisiana, the Jewish Confederate, famous for being the Jewish Confederate, he gave a talk on the Senate floor about how the states did have the right to secede, and who rebutted him but Edward Dickinson Baker, okay? And Edward Dickinson Baker simultaneously held a command as colonel in the Army, and he then established a regiment at the beginning of the Civil War, and he called it the California Regiment. in honor of his time in California. And he gave, it was mostly Pennsylvania men, and who was he put in charge of his California regiment? But his old law partner, Isaac Wistar. You'll hear more of Isaac Wistar, okay? On the October 20th, Edward Dickinson Baker went to the White House. He visited Lincoln and had a very heartfelt meeting with Lincoln and the Lincoln family at that time, before he headed out to Ball's Bluff. When he got to Ball's Bluff, his orders from Stone were to assess the situation. But Edward Dickinson Baker, being the patriot and driven as he was, you can go ahead and next one, he just started sending soldiers from the Maryland side over to the Virginia side of Ball's Bluff. And so more and more soldiers went over there. And of course, the Confederates, thanks to Walter Jennifer, kept sending more and more reinforcements up, and they kept driving back. And one of the Confederate officers who helped drive the Union forces back was Colonel Epahunton. And we'll hear more about him later, but just remember that name. So as you see, the Epahunton and others kept driving the Union forces back, even though the numbers were about equal. Okay, but remember, these are all very green troops on both sides. And the Confederates had the advantage of being on their home ground, and they kept driving. They had, the Union had, if you can go the next 3 slides quickly, they had 3 cannon, but they were not of any use because of the open area, and the Confederates stayed in the woods, okay? And then more and more Confederates kept pushing the Union closer and closer to the bluff. And then at some point, the fighting became very intense. And at that point, the Confederates were charging out of the woods, and they came out of the woods and near the tree that's still there. And if you go the next few slides here, Edward Dickinson Baker was shot and killed. He's the only sitting U.S. senator to ever be killed in combat, okay? And his body was dragged. If you go to the next slide, there is a marker at Ball's Bluff today, and it says this is where Edward Dickinson Baker was killed. The marker's probably not where he was, probably where his body was dragged to, but the marker is there commemorating the death of Edward Dickinson Baker. Also wounded, in addition to the death of Edward Dickinson Baker, but wounded was Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Wistar. Also wounded was another Union officer named Lieutenant Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. went on to become a famous Supreme Court justice appointed by none other than Theodore Roosevelt to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? After Edward Dickinson Baker's death, Colonel Milton Cogswell, the 42nd New York, took over. Now, he had a black aide with him, okay? Not a slave, he was a free man, but the story is that this black aide took up arms and fought alongside the Union soldiers. So he becomes the first black American to fight for the Union in combat in the Civil War, okay? And then Cogswell tried to make a breakout, but he was unsuccessful, and pretty soon he finds all of his forces on the very edge of the bluff. They're looking across the bluff down the hill. And what do they see on the other side? They see Winfield Scott Featherstone and his Confederates charging. And their yell is, "Drive them into the Potomac or into hell!" And so the Union soldiers go, "Potomac, hell, Potomac, hell." And so they choose the Potomac.
Go for a swim.
Right. So they went tumbling down the bluff, and it was chaotic, and many of the soldiers were hit by other soldiers' bayonets. Go back a little bit, one more. That they were into the river, the Potomac, and there were not enough boats, and some of the boats were overloaded and capsized. Go ahead. And the river just became full of bodies, okay? And it's interesting to note that the Potomac River flowed toward Washington, D.C. For the next 2 weeks, bodies were showing up on the shore of Washington, D.C., okay? So, and then you had, stop right there. In addition to that, you had what we call a hailstorm that hit the Union soldiers as they're trying to cross the Potomac. Not real hail, but bullets. The Confederate soldiers on top of the bluff were just firing down like ducks in a pond. And many of the soldiers couldn't swim. And here is one soldier, we'll hold it on this one for a bit, Lieutenant Willie Grout. He made, because he could swim, he helped a number of soldiers get across. And he was then shot and killed. And as his dying breath, he said, "Tell the colonel I did my best," as the Potomac River swallowed him up. And his body was recovered later down by Washington, D.C. But let's go to the next one. His family, that Thanksgiving, remember this is October, November, Willie Grout, they left a vacant chair for him at the family table. And a poet wrote a poem called The Vacant Chair, and then it was a song. And I'm gonna share that song with you. Let's see here. Because this song became the most popular song North and South during the war. We shall be. Well, we had it working. I apologize. In the setup, it was working fine. Let's see if we can do it this way. So that gives you an idea of the song that became the most popular song North and South, because when you had, the latest estimates are approximately 800,000 deaths in the Civil War, which is greater than all other U.S. wars combined. And so you can imagine the impact it had on the families North and South as they had to deal with the bad news that came forward. Okay, if you go ahead. Elijah White, the Leesburg native who was there helping out, he said, listen, the soldiers that didn't go across, they're probably down at the bottom of the bluff here. So he went down with a number of Confederate soldiers, and they did, in fact, capture a large number of Union soldiers, among whom was Major Paul Revere, grandson of Paul Revere of Revolutionary War fame, okay? Now, Lincoln was distraught at hearing of the death of his friend. Now remember the heartfelt poem he wrote about Eddie Baker Lincoln and the fact that he was in the carriage with him in his inauguration. Lincoln was just devastated to hear that Edward Dickinson Baker had been killed at Ball's Bluff. Now, the October 22nd, the next day, they had a truce for collection of the dead, and then there are a number of soldiers buried at Ball's Bluff, and it is the third smallest national cemetery in the country. And the soldiers, only one is identified. Now, this one is, next one, that's my daughter inside the small cemetery. There's no firearms allowed in the cemetery, but of course outside that little window you can have them, okay? Now, the next slide is a interesting marker, much like the one for Edward Dickinson Baker, only this is for Clinton Hatcher. Who was Clinton Hatcher? He was a flag bearer, and if you remember from the Civil War, flag bearers were targets. Okay, well, Clinton Hatcher had actually met Abraham Lincoln before the war because he was reportedly 6'7", 6'8", and Lincoln said, "Oh, it's nice to meet someone who's taller than I am." Okay, and he had red hair. Okay, so he stood out. Well, Elijah White, after the war, became a Leesburg banker, and he got notice that some Union veterans of Ball's Bluff were coming to visit, and would he be their tour guide? And he agreed, and so he gave them the tour, and then they asked, what happened to that big red-headed flag bearer? And Elijah White reported that he was killed at the battle. And a few months later, he got word that a package had arrived from him at the train station in Leesburg. And it was this marker. And it was, by Elijah White's report, sent by the Union soldiers, the veterans of Ball's Bluff, and go back, please. Sent by the Union soldiers who admired the bravery of Clinton Hatcher. And they did the test, and in fact, it was Quincy, Massachusetts, black granite was in fact that. So Elijah White's story was confirmed. Okay, if you look at the next one, if you go to Gettysburg, the 20th Massachusetts fought and acquitted themselves quite well at Gettysburg, and their monument is also there, the black granite. Also, the 42nd New York acquitted themselves quite well at Gettysburg, and you can find their monument there. Next time is Milton Cogswell, who took over when Edward Dickinson Baker was shot. He was, he was at the Transcontinental Railroad when the East and the West met. So you had a connection between Ball's Bluff and the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, now what happened to Charles Pomeroy Stone? Well, this is one of the tragedies of military justice, because he was declared by Charles Sumner, you may remember from the Preston caning of Sumner back in 1856, and Charles Sumner was part of the one who did the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War and was brutal toward Charles Stone. This embarrassment of Ball's Bluff, he blamed completely on Charles Stone, and it wasn't Charles Stone's fault. McClellan and Edward Dickinson Baker were blamed, but Edward Dickinson Baker was a hero. He was put in state at Independence Hall. Remember I told you there's a connection between Independence Hall? Edward Dickinson Baker was put in state at Independence Hall before he was taken out to California. So Charles Sumner was looking for a scapegoat, and they picked on Charles Stone. So the United States Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War became famous during the Civil War as the bane of almost every Union officer, because they put so much civilian scrutiny on what the military officers did that the military hated this Joint Committee, and it came from Ball's Bluff. The head of the Joint Committee was Bluff Wade, Benjamin Bluff Wade. Now the story is that he had a dance every year, and that was called Bluff's Ball. That's not true, but it should be, okay? Anyway, so Bluff Wade said, I did not order the arrest of Charles Stone. And General Winfield Scott said, if you go to the next one, if Charles Stone is a traitor, then we're all traitors. Because remember, Winfield Scott worked with Charles Stone on the security for the inauguration as well as the defenses of Washington, D.C. The soldier that was sent to arrest Charles Stone was General George Sykes, who actually was under Charles Stone. And he told Charles Stone, this is the most unpleasant task I've ever had in my entire military career. So Stone was arrested and then sent by train to Fort Lafayette Prison in the New York Harbor. Now, the interesting thing is there, the young soldier that was sent to accompany Stone to Lafayette Prison said to Stone, they didn't give me any money for a train ticket. Can I borrow the money? And so Stone had the indignity of having to lend the money to the soldier to take them to the Lafayette Prison in New York Harbor. Now, it was a very unhealthy place. Stone was not doing well there. It was out in the middle of the water. And eventually, he was moved to another fort, but This Fort Lafayette was torn down. You can go to the next one, to build the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. And that is now where the New York City Marathon begins every year. So you see how the connection between Balls Bluff and the New York City Marathon. Well, the next slide, Fort Hamilton is where Stone spent the remainder of his time. He was 6 months under arrest in prison with no charges ever brought, no court-martial, nothing. It's one of the worst tragedies of military injustice in our history. 0 charges against him. Well, you can still go to Fort Hamilton today in New York. And Bluff Wade, again, reiterated it wasn't. His committee didn't have anything to do with the arrest of Charles Stone. Secretary of War Stanton said, I didn't have anything to do with the arrest of Charles Stone. Henry Halleck, the general-in-chief, said, it was Abraham Lincoln who ordered the arrest of Charles Stone. Now, why would Lincoln do that? Remember how upset he was over his friend and that close connection he had with Edward Dickinson Baker. Now, George McClellan is owed a lot of blame for this because he kept his mouth shut. He knew Stone did nothing wrong, but it kept the focus off him. See, by having Stone be the scapegoat, McClellan, it was disgraceful what McClellan allowed to happen to Stone, okay? So, next one, Stone, after he was let out of prison, finally, and no charges were ever brought against him, but he demanded a hearing before the Joint Committee, and he did, and he demolished the charges against him. He was acquitted of any wrongdoing whatsoever, okay? Well, what happened to Charles Stone after the war? Charles Stone went to Egypt and became head of the Egyptian army, okay? In fact, the modern Egyptian army owes its thanks to Charles Stone for their organization and establishment as a major military fighting force. And also, if you look at the next slide, a big part of what Charles Stone did was he established a formidable cavalry. Well, who did he have in charge of his cavalry in Egypt? None other than Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jennifer, the Confederate cavalry leader at Balls Bluff, okay? It's hard to believe, but these are true. All right, 15 years he's in Egypt. Charles Stone comes home. What does he do? Next slide. He becomes the chief engineer for building the Statue of Liberty base, the base for the Statue of Liberty. Now, there were no funds being given by government agencies for this. Next slide. So Joseph Pulitzer, of Pulitzer Prize fame, inspired what's now known as one of the first crowdfunding operations to get many, many different Americans to donate small amounts to build the base of the Statue of Liberty. And that's how it was built, by Joseph Pulitzer's efforts and the first crowdfunding. Okay, next slide. So on the base, you had to have a skeleton for the Statue of Liberty. It was done by Gustav Eiffel. He designed the internal structure of that. And next slide. It was without that Eiffel interior skeleton, you would not have the Statue of Liberty to be able to stand on the base. And of course, next slide, he went on to build the Eiffel Tower. So you have a connection between the Eiffel Tower and Balls Bluff. And so if you see the Statue of Liberty, you look at the base, you think, well, there's Charles Stone's work, it's Joseph Pulitzer's fundraising, and the statue has Gustav Eiffel's work inside. Now, next slide is Balls Bluff today is a peaceful, beautiful little place. And when he was president, Harry Truman said, I want to go and visit this site. So he went out with George Marshall and visited the site. And they found this marker of Edward Dickinson Baker. And they said, well, where is he buried? And they found out that Edward Dickinson Baker is buried at the Presidio in San Francisco. Now, the Presidio, many of you may know, was first a Spanish fort, and then a Mexican fort, and then an American fort, and now it's mostly a tourist venue. So there's Edward Dickinson Baker, now buried overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. So if you see the Golden Gate Bridge, you think, well, that's Edward Dickinson Baker's current view. He also has a view of Alcatraz. You can go there. Here's my daughter with Alcatraz in the background. And he is buried at the Presidio. Go to the next couple slides here. and there's his tombstone at the Presidio. So Edward Dickinson Baker, the story of him, as you can see, and there he is, his tombstone at the Presidio. Okay, next one. The Presidio is also interesting because you have cannon there that were forged in Peru in the 1600s. Presidio is a fantastic place to visit. Okay, let's go next to Loretta Velasquez. She was one of the many women who dressed as a man and fought in the Civil War. Now, she claimed that she was at Ball's Bluff. She wasn't. There was pretty good evidence she was not at Ball's Bluff. But to give you an idea that it was prestigious to have been at Ball's Bluff, even though we don't know about Ball's Bluff today. At the time, it was a big deal. So she claimed to have been there, but she actually was not. There's a book, great book on called A Little Short of Boats. Fantastic book if you want more of the details of the battle and what have you. Now, I told you there was a connection with the Bahamas. Now, what's the connection with the Bahamas? Well, remember, this is like after Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Munson Hill, and then you have Ball's Bluff, one Union disaster after another. Well, in November of 8th, not just a few weeks after Ball's Bluff, you had what's called the Trent Affair. Go ahead. And that was where a U.S. ship under Charles Wilkes stopped a British ship, and they took off the British ship 2 Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell. And the British were outraged by this because they had no right, the U.S. had no right to stop their ships in international waters and take off passengers on their ships. And the British were ready to go to war over it. It was, and some of Lincoln's advisors said, let's go to fight. Let's fight the British. And Lincoln said, let's fight one war at a time. And so Lincoln was saying, Charles Wilkes became a hero because this is the first good news. This is somebody's finally doing something for the North that worked, you know. He showed them. He wasn't afraid. So Lincoln had a problem. He had a diplomatic rupture with England, and he had a U.S. hero in Charles Wilkes. Well, he was saved by none other than Napoleon III of France, who wrote a blistering letter to Lincoln, excoriating Lincoln for taking these men off the ship. So Lincoln was able to write a letter back basically telling Napoleon III to stuff it, and that got publicized. At the same time, he turned Mason and Slidell back over to the British and solved that particular problem, okay? But it all became because of that, okay? Now, let's go ahead. The next one, we've already talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. Next, Epahunton, who became, after the war, a U.S. senator. Remember, he was one of the ones charging the Union lines at Ball's Bluff, driving them to the Bluff. And his son became a famous lawyer and is now the namesake of one of the largest law firms in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, now, what happened to Isaac Wistar? Okay, well, he became a general. He had wounded at Ball's Bluff, but then he became a general. And then after the war, he started in Pennsylvania the Wistar Institute for Medical Research. And they are one of the ones doing significant research on the coronavirus. So now you have Ball's Bluff connection to the coronavirus, okay? And then you had the Grand Review of the Union Army. Again, this was McClellan trying to do something, right? So in November, about a month after Ball's Bluff and after the Charles Wilkes Trent Affair, he said, well, let's have a Grand Review to show how great the Army is. And he does this. And so he had Lincoln come to Bailey's Crossroads and view it. And also present was Julia Ward Howe. And she was the one who was told, well, ultimately she wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, but the soldiers there were singing John Brown's Body, okay? I won't share the song with you. We're running out of time, I know. But John Brown's Body, and one of the men she was with said, it's a catchy tune, but you should come up with better lyrics. And so she said, I can do that. So she went back to her hotel at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., and wrote the lyrics to what is now the Battle Hymn of the Republic, okay? Now, the Battle Hymn of the Republic has some great lines. one, go ahead. The one is in the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free while God is marching on. Well, now politically correct people have said, oh, we got to change that. Instead of let us die, let us live to make men free. It's a shame that, when you understand that this was done in honor of the soldiers who were fighting and were dying, that people have to try to whitewash things today. It's just a shame. But anyway, then the University of Georgia, their fight song is based on the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, okay? Next, from that Battle Hymn of the Republic lyrics, John Steinbeck got his title for The Grapes of Wrath. With the grapes of wrath, vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. And you had Moby Dick, Herman Melville even wrote a piece on, you can just go ahead, we don't need to do that, a whole poem on that. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., he was a huge fan of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So was Winston Churchill. In fact, Winston Churchill so liked the Battle Hymn of the Republic that he said, I want it played at my funeral. And it was. And that is the story of Ball's Bluff and the amazing connections with the little battle of 1861.
Wow, that's a lot of interwoven history. Thank you very much. So, you open to taking a few questions
Sure,
if anyone has any?
Absolutely.
Do we have any questions in the audience?
So I guess Ball's Bluff was considered a defeat for the Union Army, is that right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay. And is there a reason it hasn't taken more of a predominant position in history?
Because you had about 3,000 soldiers on each side. It was dwarfed by later battles. So by later standards, it was a skirmish in terms of the number of soldiers involved. And it didn't do anything strategically for either side. It was more of the connections and the kind of the embarrassment to the Union that it provided than anything strategically. In other words, the South didn't really gain anything from it other than we won.
The empty chair, does that have any correlation with the missing man table that the military currently uses?
I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised because the vacant chair was so popular, north and south, that it wouldn't surprise me that it carried on in other ways. But I can't say for certain.
So since you're both a lawyer and a Civil War historian, do you know if this Uniform Code of Military Justice that let this man be imprisoned for 6 months as a serving officer without charge, was it the same one we have now? Has it changed much? Any details on just legally how they were able to do that? And was there no JAG Corps? And I guess in war, all rules are off.
Yeah, there wasn't a JAG Corps then, but it was illegal. I mean, there was no justification legally for maintaining him in prison for 6 months with no charges being brought, not even a court-martial being brought. It was absolutely, totally illegal.
Just write him orders to go to this prison?
They just said, go arrest him. And apparently it was Abraham Lincoln. We can't say for certain that it was Abraham Lincoln because Abraham Lincoln never confessed to having done it, but Halleck said that it was Lincoln who gave the orders to arrest Charles Stone.
All right. That's all of our questions. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. If you liked what you heard, like it, follow us on YouTube, and take us in the car on Spotify. We've got podcasts out there. You can listen while you drive.
Thank you all very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hi.
I'm Edward.
Oh, hi, Edward.
Real quick
I
before you
wanted
take
to
up too much of
personally
his time.
compliment you on your discussion.
Oh,
I
thank
have
you.
a YouTube addiction.